All right, let's finally talk about constraints. I know it took a while, but all the things we've learned so far are important to properly work with constraints because we will use them in combination. So we already know constraints from Vellum, and basically all it is connections between, well, in Vellum points and in RBDs pieces of our fractured object. So what I have here is a simple box that I put on the ground with a match size so that we have a wall that is always properly on the ground. And then I just scatter some points outside. I should have scattered them inside, but it's not important for such a thin wall. And then with a Voronoi fracture, I fractured it. That's it, nothing special. Now, if I put this into an RBD bullet solver and just connect it with the first input, of course, what will happen is, well, first of all, it will just fall down. But if we activate the ground plane, then it will just, crumble and collapse on itself. This is expected because there's nothing holding it together. So this is where the constraints come in, and this is actually the second output here. And what comes out of this is actually already connections between the pieces. You might have already noticed it by playing around. And what this is completely normal curves or edges. So we have just a couple of points connected with some curves, and that's what constraints are. This is enough for the bullet solver to understand that there are supposed to be connections, because of course those lines represent those connections. If you just connect it directly though, you will run into the problem that nothing has changed. You will just, have the same behavior. But at least the RBD bullet solver in Houdini 19 will complain a bit, because it understood that there are constraints, but there is a constraint name primitive attribute missing. What does that mean? Well, the Voronoi fracture, even though it gives us those connection lines, is not enough to have a proper constraint. Again, when we look at what comes out of it, and we look at the attributes down here, then we see that, oh, this is interesting. On each point, we have actually a name attribute, which, by the way, of course, corresponds to the pieces this point is kind of representing. What's more interesting, though, is what's on the curves themselves, what kind of attributes are on the primitives. And there's only one attribute called rest length. And you might imagine what that is. That's simply the length of the curve when it was created. And this is why every edge or every curve here has a different rest length. But that's not enough to tell RBD bullet solver what this is supposed to do. To do this, there is a node called RBD constraint properties that we need in combination with the Voronoi fracture. And it has the same inputs, so we can make sure that the constraints and the geometry are connected. And this node, as the name suggests, only changes properties on the constraints, not on the geometry. So the wall itself has not changed whatsoever. It's still the same. What it has changed, though, is some information on our constraint curves. And when we look at the geometry spreadsheet again, we can see it added a couple of very important attributes, like the constraint name that the RBD bullet solver was complaining about. And this is set to glue. Why? Because there are basically, at least in the RBD constraint properties node, 3 constraint types that we can choose from: glue, hard, and soft. We will talk about hard and soft later on. Actually, we will have an overview over the constraints in the next video. But by far the most important one for a beginner is glue, and this is what we will talk about most. What this, as the name suggests, really is you take 2 pieces and connect them. And the interesting thing about the glue constraint is they can break if there is enough impact of, pushing them apart, so to say. This is different to the hard and soft constraint. And this is, by the way, why it's called hard, because it's not breakable. The glue constraint is breakable. Again, we will talk about this later. For now, let's concentrate on the glue constraint. And now that we have this information, besides a couple of other attributes, by the way, like the strength, which is important, we actually now have an RBD bullet solver that's not complaining anymore because he got everything he expected. And when we press start now, then nothing happens, which is actually as expected because all those pieces here are glued together. So of course they stay together. Just by itself, that doesn't make sense. We need some kind of impact or something to break them apart. Why else would we have broken them up in the first place? So one thing we could do here, for example, is we just move our box up. Well, that will not help because the match size will always put it on the ground. So let's add a transform maybe in between here and move the whole thing up. and let us have the wall fall down on the ground plane. And then you can see there's actually something happening. Not that much, but something kind of broke off here. So what's happening is that the glue constraint, as you've seen, has a certain strength. And we can control this. You've seen that as an attribute called strength with 10,000. And this is what's set here below where you define what the constraint type should be. There is the strength. And 10,000 very often is very high. So let's lower this to 1,000 maybe and see what happens. And now we get something. And the cool thing is now that those pieces are broken off, hopefully the wall will fall down. Well, kind of. Well, let's maybe increase the number of points so that we have smaller pieces. So maybe 400. Let's move up the wall a little bit and maybe lower the constraint strength further to maybe 500. And then we should get much more destruction from this. There you go. More pieces falling. And then, yeah, okay. This is what I wanted. I've seen it better. But the idea here is, what I wanted to show you is once it's broken in some pieces, it can fall over and then get another break up. And this is what's so cool about the glue constraint. All those pieces are constantly able to break off. So you can get, secondary reactions if there is more than one impact. So instantly it looks pretty interesting. Let's make maybe the wall a bit higher. I think this could also help. But I think you get the idea, right? So as soon as you have some kind of impact that can be on the ground or from, as we will see, from another object. So this is nice. And here you can see, yeah, that's even better, that sometimes some pieces can stay together. And then you have a really interesting result. A small note on this. What I did to move my wall up is to use a transform before I Voronoi fracture the whole thing. Of course, that makes a lot of sense, but actually just for you to know, I could have actually just Voronoid the thing and then just moved the geometry somewhere else. Now this will look weird because then the constraints seem to be disconnected from the geometry, but those constraints just define a relationship between the pieces. They do not have to be exactly overlapping. And as you can see here, this will still work, even though that's a bit surprising. But for later on, when you have more complex scenes, that's really helpful to know that the constraints and the geometry do not have to perfectly overlap because you have created them originally at the same position. If you move them afterwards, disconnected from each other, that's not a problem. So anyway, we will talk about this kind of stuff more in the future. For now, let's stick with the important technical stuff. So the first thing you need to understand is we already talked about the importance of the name attribute. Now here, this actually really comes to play because what you might do later on, and we actually will, is currently those pieces here are normal geometry. But we already used the technique of packing them because usually the RBD bullet solver prefers working with packed geometry anyway. So let's use an assemble and activate the packed primitives. And in this case, actually, you won't get any trouble because this is a weird coincidence. What happens here is that the assemble not only is packing the geometry, but also creating a new name attribute with a piece as a prefix. The same is actually coming from the Voronoi fracture. Here it's also a piece as a prefix. So even though the assemble currently overwrites the name attribute of the Voronoi fracture, it will still work because, coincidentally, it's the same result. But let's say we would change the assemble name here and we will overwrite the name attribute, then very important, this will happen. Your constraints stop working. Why is that? I assume you already guessed it. The reason is that in the constraints that were created by the Voronoi fracture, each point of your curves, like we said, gets a name attribute corresponding to the pieces that it created. Now, if I later on still use those constraints with the same points, but my pieces get a different name when they go into the RBD bullet solver, packed or not, then the constraints will not find those pieces anymore and they will not constrain them. So very obvious in a simple example like here, and easy to fix, but be careful when you have bigger projects, when you break up whole houses with different elements like doors, windows, roofs and whatnot. Really easily it can happen to you that you overwrite the name attribute. So be careful when you use an assemble after you created your constraints, then make sure you do not create a name attribute so that they don't override it. And now, of course, the whole thing works again, even though the pieces are now packed, but the name attribute is still kept alive from the Voronoi fracture. So this is kind of the, the simplest form of building up a constraint-based RBD simulation. But there's actually a quicker way, and we've already seen the RBD material fracture can be an alternative to all this. So let's steal the geometry and create a second version of this, because the RBD material fracture will not only create fracture pieces for us, and for now let's just increase the number of pieces here. Let's not go too deep into fine tweaking this. This is good enough for now. And the interesting thing here is that when we use constraints that come out of the RBD material fracture, because it's, a one-size-fits-all node, you will see that on the primitives, all the attributes we talked about, the constraint name and the strength and other things we will talk about, and the rest length we mentioned, are already there. So you don't need an RBD constraint properties when working with the RBD material fracture. All of this is already built in. And of course, you will find it in the constraints tab at the very end, where you can define what constraint you want. The interesting thing here is it will always create a glue constraint, so you can't switch the type here. And then of course you also have the strength and a multiplier, and that's interesting. The multiplier here is between the different levels. Remember, we saw that the RBD material fracture, the way it works is it creates one breakup, and then for each piece of that breakup, you can add another level of breakup, and for those pieces, another level. And the idea here is that those connections are then differently strong. So under constraints, the level multiplier says, okay, the first connection is roughly 10,000, and then with every level of breakup, it gets stronger so that those bigger pieces try to stay together more. Another thing, when you look closely at what comes out of it, is that the strength is actually not 10,000 or 50,000 or something, but actually a pretty random number. And that is because there is a variation in here, a strength variance. And that's actually pretty nice, because it means that all the pieces are kind of similar, but not exactly the same, which in theory gives you a more dynamic breakup later on, because each connection is slightly different. This is a bit like you would imagine it in reality. Not every piece of a brick wall is connected exactly with the same strength. There are all kinds of factors involved that make them easier to break or something. But this is actually already built in the RBD constraint properties as well. There it is, the strength variance. So you can activate that too, and now you have a more varied strength as well with the RBD constraint properties. All right, so let's finally let it fall down, because we talked about this the whole time but never saw it. And what we forgot, of course, is activating the ground plane. There you go. And now finally we have some destruction, and probably too strong. Yes, as you can see, it's so strong, nothing happens, and that's because 10,000 is usually too high. So let's try 500 again. Finding the right strength is purely guessing work. So there is no, technical way of figuring the best number out. This is trial and error. This is what takes the most time to try different things. And here you can see that the pieces, and you can kind of see it on the edges, that stay together actually have a stronger connection, so they try to stay together more. To prove that, let's lower the level multiplier back to 1, so that between the different levels there is no strength difference, only the variance. And then the pieces will break up in the same fashion, so to say. So the smaller pieces will be breaking off as easily as the bigger pieces, and you have a completely different result. So this multiplier here is very important, and the strength overall is very important to control how your destruction will look like. So as you can see, if you really wanted to have the smallest setup, then actually the RBD material fracture would be your friend, because you technically only need 2 nodes, the RBD material fracture doing the fracturing and creating the constraints, and then of course the RBD bullet solver calculating the sim. So only that much for now as a first glance into the world of constraints. Of course we will talk about this way more in the next couple of videos, but those are the most important things for now. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much, and see you later. Cheers.